DC Comics over the years has gotten themselves into some hot water with some controversial stories. They've had comics and storylines and events that have really riled up the fans, garnered a lot of hate and polarization, and have even had stories so controversial they have caused irreparable changes throughout the entire comic book medium as a whole. And today we're going to go through those. We're going to look at the top 5 most controversial stories or events in all of DC Comics, and I got these by looking at a variety of posts, forums, rankings, things like that, as well as my own knowledge of just being around comic books for so long. So without further delay, let's get into the top 5 most controversial stories or comics in all of DC. To number 5, we have the infamous Batman Damned Issue 1 comic, a DC Black Label series aimed at more mature audiences that showcased Batman for the first time in a compromised state, let's say. That's right, this is the book that for the first time and presumably last time actually showed Batman's junk. And it's not like this was a mistake or this was an accident or something. The heads at DC at the time were fine with it. The artist obviously submitted that page for approval. It was approved. Everything seemed like it was the way it was supposed to be until that page and this comic started circulating around the media because of this quote-unquote controversy. It was getting laughed at quite a bit because obviously it's like a huge shock seeing, Batman's junk. And the timing could not have been worse because at this time there's a new head of DC being placed maybe the same day the comic came out, and this new head of DC and Warner Brothers as a whole did not like the press that this comic was getting. They stopped selling the comic. They went and redid the comic so that it didn't show anything inappropriate. In fact, the artist was even told to black out Batman's area on his original artwork so that there is no original or alternate page. Now this is the official page where nothing is shown. Though there were still repercussions from this, the writer says that this has tainted his relationship with DC going forward. Even though, again, he had total approval to do this, everything was fine up until it actually got published, and people either took offense to it, even though it was aimed at mature audiences. I think people just kind of weren't ready for that, or the added controversy of them removing it and putting a lot of the blame on the writer-artist team, even though, again, it was already approved. Regardless, if you remember this was just a few years ago, this was all over the press, all over different YouTube channels covering certainly one of Batman's more controversial moments. Personally, I think it's kind of funny. It is kind of like a who asked for this, why does this need to be here moment. But it's kind of funny. It is a mature comic. That's what the whole Black Label series is for. So I do understand DC wanting to remove that and make that change, but I think the way they handled it was not great. Moving on to number 4, we have the Dark Knight's Metal event. This was by Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo, the very famous DC team that did the very highly regarded Batman series in the 2010s. Greg Capullo is obviously a very famous artist for a long time, having done Spawn and other things before, and Scott Snyder, it seemed like anything that he wrote was just great, so a perfect team to handle one of DC's biggest events. However, it really missed the mark, and if I'm honest, this was something I was really looking forward to. I had met Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo a handful of times. They're my favorite artist-writer team, so I was really looking forward to this event, and it really wasn't that good. First off, the plot itself was very complicated. It was a little convoluted and hard to follow at times, but overall the quality was just a step down from what we were used to. The writing was worse. It was not as good as Scott's other series. It was a step down from his Batman series, and the art was worse. It looked like Greg Capullo was phoning it in a little bit at times, and that was a big complaint with the series. This also introduced things like the Batman Who Laughs and other very edgy, over-the-top Batman variant characters, and you know how I feel about the Batman Who Laughs if you've seen my other videos. But even the other Batman variants that were created, total wasted potential. Nothing was really done with them. The tie-ins all pretty much sucked. For an event, it was just a pretty big letdown. And again, it was like a Wonder Woman story, which was strange. I don't think anybody was really asking for that. I don't think that's where Scott Snyder really shines as a writer. So in my opinion, it was a pretty big misstep, and I think a lot of people agree with me. At the time, whenever this came out and was running, there was quite a bit of surprise, I think. A lot of people thought it would be better and were excited for it, but it really did not meet expectations, leaving this event with really mixed reviews. Number 3, we have a controversy that came not from the actual story of the comic, but from its cover, and this one is fairly recent. If you remember back to 2023, with the Power Girl Special number 1, there was a variant cover by artist Warren Lowe that displays Power Girl kind of in a, we'll say, like, hyper stylized anatomically kind of way, which is really nothing new for Power Girl. She's always been a controversial character because of her anatomy and costume and the fact that she has the boob window. And DC has been trying for a long time to sort of fix that image of her character to make her more complex and less sexualized overall. They've tried to explain away why she has the boob window so many times, and it never really works out. But this particular cover for this particular comic sparked more backlash and outrage than usual, because a lot of more progressive comic book readers saw this as a step back for the character, who want to move past the sort of tight, stylized, focus on the cleavage type of thing for Power Girl, which is what the comic is sort of about too. The comic, again, doesn't quite match that art style or that tone. It is trying to take the character into a more serious, or at least more complex role than just, dumbing her down to the big boob girl. But if you were locked into comic book news and controversy at this time, this picture was everywhere. I mean, this was huge news. And I think originally it started out as the controversy of saying, like, look how crazy this is that they're still doing this with Power Girl in 2023. But I feel like it kind of backfired, because a lot of people looked at that and said, like, wow, that looks really good. That's really awesome art. And I want to say that that variant cover probably outsold all the other ones. Now, interesting is the response from DC, and that's because they did not have a response. So those who like the more fan service type of thing were sort of in the clear, and the people who were pushing for this to be either taken down or removed got nothing out of it, which I gotta say, good on DC, I think, for acknowledging that, like, it's fine. It's a pretty sexual character, so having a sort of sexualized cover a little bit's fine. Also, it is kind of pandering to the actual people who buy those sort of comics, because a lot of the people who on social media are lamenting the fact that she's being portrayed this way don't actually read comics and don't actually buy them. So good on DC, again, even in this day and age, not kowtowing and virtue signaling and taking it down, but just kind of letting it ride and letting the controversy die down on its own. Number 2, we have All-Star Batman and Robin. This is by the great Frank Miller, but man, this is one that a lot of people consider not only a extremely controversial comic, but one of the worst comics ever created. Now, Frank Miller is maybe the greatest comic book mind of all time when it comes to Batman Year One, Daredevil, Born Again, Dark Knight Returns, all of the greats, but at the same time, his more recent stuff, really anything post-2000, really does kind of fall flat, and All-Star Batman and Robin is an example of that. This is one of those comics where it is so bad, it's kind of funny and almost entertaining as a parody, because Batman in this series is so over the top and so edgy and just mean and cruel. It's to the point of parody, and I don't think that's even an exaggeration. Like, not only is he overly violent, over aggressive, his dialogue is extremely hilarious. He's like just swearing in like every sentence, and he's so intense and so serious and mean like all the time. This is also the one where he essentially kidnaps Robin and enlists him into his war and locks him down in the Batcave and makes him eat rats. He's also like verbally abusive, calls him retarded and stuff like that. Again, it's so over the top. Also, the plot line and some of the storylines were also pretty stupid. Like whenever they beat Green Lantern by painting a room yellow. Because that, Green Lantern can't affect yellow is kind of an outdated thing that kind of hasn't been a thing for a very long time. But again, Frank Miller's old school comic, so to him, he probably thinks that's still the case. But it's one of those things where it's like, this is a comic from a different era. A lot of people have said, well, this is the same tone, attitude, structure, style of like Sin City or some of his other comics. It's just the fact that we're reading it now in the modern age that we realize how terrible it is. And I don't think that's totally the case. I think that's maybe part of it. But I think there's an aspect of it too, of Frank Miller being past his prime and going way too far on like the dark, edgy, aggressive train, and having a character so far removed from the Batman that we're used to, it is to the point of parody. This is one of those books you'll find that has almost no defenders, so it's hard to call it controversial, except for the fact that whenever it was released and did come out, the conversation around it was very strong, to say the least, and today you'll still find it being one of the most talked about comics in terms of being such a shock to what they were actually expecting versus what they actually got. Now, I typically have an honorable mention, but not today. Today, I want to get right into number one because it's kind of a big topic. And number one is going to be the famous Women in Refrigerators comic, the single comic, Green Lantern 54, that fundamentally changed comics forever. If you're unfamiliar with the Women in Refrigerators issue and all that controversy, in the 2010s, there was a pretty big shift, I think followed by the whole Gamergate stuff, of women's attitude towards comic books and like the attitude that people take when they're making comic books and how women are misrepresented and mistreated and all that stuff. And one of the key heads of that was Gail Simone, comic book writer, who is not terrible all the time, but as a person, she's pretty insufferable. But she waged the feminist war against comic culture as a whole. And one of the main things cited here was this Women in Refrigerators topic, where a lot of time women in comics are mistreated in order to advance the storyline of the men in the comics, and this being a prime example for Kyle Rayner, Green Lantern. He comes home and he finds his girlfriend has been like chopped up and put in his fridge by the villain Major Force. Big shock to his character and everything. It's pretty grotesque, a little over the top, and that is being used as the cudgel on which to beat the quote-unquote, male-dominated species by the feminists who want a spot in comics. And you might think like, oh, whatever, who cares? They can complain all they want, doesn't matter. Except this one actually did make some pretty significant changes in the comic book world. The comic book world is pretty left-leaning as a whole when it comes to the actual creators, if you didn't know that. And so this was kind of a rallying cry and wake up to a lot of them, and it led to the total infiltration and control of the American comic book market, both Marvel and DC, by left-wing ideology, by progressives, by feminists, and we saw that huge change, especially post-2015, this huge change in comics where political agenda and ideology is taking the forefront. A lot of comics are, lectures, tons of characters are turning gay or being race swapped and everything like that. All of that was spurned on and started by this whole Comicsgate, as opposed to Gamergate, Gail Simone, Women in Refrigerators topic. And the effects of that are still felt today. I think they're dying down now to a degree, like 10 years later, but the effects are still felt today and their grip on the industry is still very strong. This led to directly characters like Miss Marvel Kamala Khan being created and other things like that, and mountains and mountains of terrible comic book stories. Because now at the helm no longer was creativity or storytelling or fun action, any of that was at the front. Now at the front was ideology, was making sure that women have a place in comics, etc., etc. And so you got a lot of garbage. So this is probably the most controversial thing that ever happened in comics, period, not just for DC. But this shakeup, this change in the comic book world, one, was very real and very felt, and you've probably felt it too. If you read comics and stopped reading comics like I did, it was probably because the aftermath of this event. That totally made reading modern Marvel and DC comics unreadable. And still to this day, I don't read many modern Marvel and DC comics because the effects are still being felt. So that is why I do rank it number one. Whereas these other comics were all terrible, they all had public backlash, outcry, some changes made to them because of the backlash they've gotten. Only this top one, only the Women in Refrigerators, caused real world change, real comic book world change, and a different trajectory for the industry as a whole, and led to a lot of death of the industry as we've seen since then. But that is just my opinion. Let me know if I missed the most controversial DC story of all time. Let me know in the comments down below, and I will see